Yes, so today my talk has got quite a broad historical sweep, going indeed from the 18th century up to the present day. And in a talk of about 20 minutes, I need to mention about 20 people, which would be could get very dry and confusing, I think, for you all. So I've got a kind of crib sheet here, which I can give out now. I made 20 copies, so some people may have to share. So we get them going on both sides, perhaps. So that you can then, when I mention names, you can actually look down and see, oh, that's the person she's talking about. So I just give a moment for those to circulate, because there's nothing more frustrating than trying to look at a piece of paper you've been given at the same time as hearing what somebody's talking to you about. There should be enough if you share. I counted, and I mean, I only did the photocopying a couple of days ago without any idea whether there were 6 people or 60. But counting the number of pews and having bought 20 copies, I think everyone should be able to see something. Right, I'll begin. So I'm going to introduce you to no less than 15 women. There are more than numbers on that sheet, but introductions to 15 who were published writers. They didn't just write, but they published, often with quite well-known publishers, from the 18th century to the present day. And I'm not sure what's more striking, really, that there are so many, and also that we are all related. Because the LeFanu family, sadly, no longer living in Ireland, because we're spread across the world, but we all are related, and we all are in touch and know of each other. We're related through our common ancestor, the Huguenot Guillaume LeFanu, who came to Dublin as a refugee in the early 18th century. After, in France, it was no longer possible to be a Protestant in France. So he was a Huguenot who came to Dublin. 3 of his sons, Joseph, Henry, and Peter LeFanu, married grandchildren of Dr. Thomas Sheridan, the friend of Swift. So that began the long connection which led my grandfather to write, all living LeFanus are also of Sheridan blood. And the novelist Joseph Sheridan LeFanu obviously bears that out in his name. And it's why my talk is not only about LeFanu women, but also about their cousins, the Sheridans, with whom they were all blood relations. Anyway, I prefer, rather than starting with Sheridan, I prefer to start with these words. I have Chamberlain blood. Frances Chamberlain was my great-great-great-great-grandmother. She was the wife of Thomas Sheridan the Younger, and she was a very remarkable and gifted woman. She was born in Dublin, 1724. She partly lived in London, where she was very much admired by Boswell and Dr. Johnson. And she died too young, 1766. She published pamphlets. She published 2 novels. One of them, The Memoir of Miss Sidney Biddulph, was a bestseller in its time. And there was another, The History of Noor Jahad, also popular. And she wrote 3 plays. One of them, which was called The Discovery, was produced at Drury Lane in 1763 and had a very long run. And Garrick said it was the best comedy of the age. There's a modern edition of her plays, and I will come back to them later, and I recommend them. Her novels, they were treasured by other writers, Fanny Burney and particularly Maria Edgeworth. And indeed, Sidney Biddulph has been reissued by Pandora Press, so you can get hold of it, put it on your Kindle. Without a doubt, Frances Chamberlain is a major literary figure. She had 4 surviving children of the 6 that she bore: Charles, Alicia, Richard Brinsley, and Elizabeth, who was known as Betsy. Well, I don't need to introduce you to Richard Brinsley Sheridan, brilliant politician, author of The Rivals and The School for Scandal. plays actually which are quite indebted to his mother's plays. But I do need to introduce you to his sisters, Alicia and Betsy, because they were both published writers and they both married LeFanus. Alicia Sheridan married Joseph LeFanu in 1781. She wrote poetry. Her poems were published in 1795, and she wrote plays, including The Sons of Erin, which was staged in Dublin in 1812. She and Joseph LeFanu loved the theatre. They both acted regularly in Dublin. They were not puritanical people at all. And it's through their son, Thomas LeFanu, that the connection with Abington begins. But that's to jump ahead. First, I want to talk to you about Betsy. Alicia's younger sister, Betsy, married Joseph's brother, Henry LeFanu, and Betsy, too, was a writer. Her novel, The India Voyage, came out in 1804, and she kept a lively journal made of letters to her sister, Alicia, in Dublin, while she, Betsy, was living in London with their father. And she paints a very vivid picture of 18th century life, as well as keeping Alicia informed on the latest English fashions and the latest theatrical gossip. So I'm going to quote you a few bits from her journal. In 1785, she went to Westminster Abbey for the annual huge concert commemorating Handel. She says, "At 12 the performance began, and never was I more truly delighted. The beginning of the Te Deum was so truly great that my whole frame thrilled, and the tears ran down my cheeks in spite of me. I would have given anything to have been behind a pillar to have cried in comfort. I thought the only homage worthy of the divine being which I had ever heard offered up. The number of performers did not by any means produce a too powerful sound. An oratorio in the round churches appeared to me infinitely louder. All was one complete full sound, the most perfect that can be conceived. The band consisted of 600 performers, and they entirely filled a scaffolding that was raised almost to the ceiling of the abbey." They were in Westminster Abbey. "The whole place was boarded, side seats raised, but not entirely to conceal the monuments, which added rather to the dignity and solemnity of the scene. With regard to the company, the women appeared to disadvantage, as being forbidden hats and feathers, they had almost uniformly put on the most disfiguring headdress I ever saw, a mob of a most immense size, simply illustrated with blue or yellow ribbons. This over frizzed heads and sallow complexions had a very bad effect. A few, with fair skins and clear brown hair, bore the disguise tolerably." She was always very amusing and perceptive in her observations. For example, this is Betsy writing when she met Dr. Morton. "He's head of the museum, a gigantic man who evidently has been handsome. He's a great diseur de rien." They all use French as much as English, and she means he's a lot of sweet nothings. "And at the same time, a male creature laying violent hands on a considerable share of the conversation." I think we're all familiar with, especially women, at a time when one person will dominate a conversation. Later than this, before her marriage to Henry LeFanu, Betsy lived at her brother Dick's house, that's Dick, i.e. Richard Brinsley, the playwright, in London. He was at the height of his political career, much better known in his lifetime as a politician, really, than as a playwright, not like now. He was constantly at the side of the Prince of Wales, and Betsy's letters capture all the excitement of the Regency crisis. She was very fond of her sister-in-law, that's the playwright's wife, who was the beautiful soprano, very famous in her day, Elizabeth Linley. But Betsy didn't approve at all of the free and easy morals of the smart set her brother moved in. But luckily for us, she tells us all about when she went with Eliza Linley to a masquerade, i.e. a fancy dress ball. They were dressed as gypsies for their disguise. Betsy says, "Our dress, which I thought ugly enough, was, however, very much admired." And then she describes the amazing setting for the ball, amazing decorations, rooms ornamented with coloured lamps, natural flowers in abundance. And then her journal continues, "About 1, the princes arrived, all dressed alike as Highland chiefs. Nothing could be more elegant or becoming than their dress. The prince came up at once to Mrs. Sheridan to inquire for Dick, and gave such an inquiring stare at me that she thought it best to introduce me. He has his father's passion for knowing who and what everyone is." That was King George. "At 2 the supper rooms were opened. The etiquette is always to have a room for the prince, who chooses his company. He, as usual, asked for Mrs. Sheridan, and she kept fast hold of me till we got into the room. The Duke of Clarence took the head of the table, and the Prince placed himself on one side with Mrs. Sheridan at his right hand. I sat next, and my dear brother next to me. Opposite us sat Lady Buchanan as a Sœur Grise, i.e. a nun, casting many tender looks across the table, which to my great joy did not seem much attended to. Betsy was very critical of her brother, who was a great philanderer, and was carrying on with Lady Buchanan, grand lady. And she concludes, I could not help thinking that while I was supping with princes and great people, that my situation was a little like poor Gil Blas in the novel. I have had a peep at the raree show of the great world, without trouble or risk, and not being young enough to have my brain turned, shall enjoy my broiled bone in Cuff Street with as much pleasure as ever. Her journal was edited by my father, and it's still in print. You can find it online. And it's a great read. It is really quite striking how vivid Betsy is in bringing that world to life, while being very content with her own world, which was certainly not a world of the English aristocracy into which her brother had moved. The next generation also produced a writer, Betsy's daughter, Alicia LeFanu the Younger. She published prolifically poems, novels, including Strathallan, another bestseller, published in 1816, and a memoir of the life and writings of her famous grandmother, Mrs. Frances Sheridan, that is, Frances Chamberlain, with whom I began. And then in the same generation is the person whom I think we should particularly celebrate today, Emma Lucretia Dobbin, who married Thomas LeFanu, son of Alicia the Elder, in Finglas in 1811, and as we know is the mother of William, Joseph and Catherine. Emma was a prolific writer of articles for journals, i.e. published articles, and she too, like Betsy, had a very lively writing style. And this is clear from her vivid account of recovering, or some might say stealing, the dagger with which Lord Edward Fitzgerald defended himself in 1798. In the memoir, 70 Years of Irish Life, by her son William, my great-grandfather, he gives the story in her own words, and since some of you won't know it, I'm going to read it now. So these are the words of Emma Lucretia. I was almost a child when I possessed myself of the dagger with which Lord Edward Fitzgerald had to defend himself so desperately at the time of his arrest. The circumstances connected with it are these. Mrs. Swan, wife of Major Swan, was a relative of my mother. Our family constantly visited at her house in North Great George's Street. My mother often took my younger sister and me there. I often heard Major Swan describe the dreadful struggle in which he had himself received a wound from the dagger which he had succeeded in wresting from Lord Edward, and which he, Major Swan, took a pleasure in showing as a trophy. The dreadful conflict is described in the registers of the day. The death wound which Lord Edward received and the death of Captain Ryan are known to everyone. The character of Lord Edward, the position which he held in his tragical death, the domestic happiness which he had enjoyed and the affection which he held those near to him, I need not describe. When I saw the dagger in the hands with which Lord Edward had striven in the last fatal struggle for life or death, I felt that it was not rightfully his who held it and wished it were in other hands. Wishes soon changed into plans, and I determined, if possible, to get it. I knew the spot in the front drawing room where it was laid, and one evening after tea, when Major Swan and his guests were engaged in conversation in the back drawing room, I walked into the front drawing room to the spot where it was. I seized it and thrust it into my bosom inside my stays. I returned to the company, where I had to sit for an hour, and then drove home a distance of 3 miles. As soon as we left the house, I told my sister, who was beside me, what I'd done. And when we got home, I rushed up to the room which my sister and I occupied, and having secured the door, I opened one of the seams in the feather bed, took out the dagger, and plunged it in among the feathers. For upwards of 12 years, I lay every night upon the bed which contained my treasure. When I left home, I took it with me, and it has been my companion in all the vicissitudes of life. So all the while the struggles were going on here, at Glebe House, there was that dagger in her bed. When he missed it, Major Swan was greatly incensed, and not without apprehensions that it had been taken to inflict a deadly revenge upon him. Had he taken harsh measures against the servants, whom he might have suspected, I had resolved to confess that I'd taken it, but after a time his anger and uneasiness subsided. I have often seen and heard this dagger described as, an amazing weapon, and I've been ready to laugh when I've heard it so described. Well, I can show you the size of the dagger. It's only about this long, and you can see it in Dublin in the National Museum in Collins Barracks, because Emma Dobbin, who became Emma LeFanu, passed it to her son William LeFanu. He in turn passed it to his son Thomas. They're always William and Thomas in this family. And then to his son, another William, my father, who wished it to go to the museum in Dublin, where it now is. Undoubtedly, Emma was a talented and adventurous girl. In her heart, more or less a rebel, wrote her son. And she was always loved and popular. One cousin, Frances LeFanu, wrote, "She has the sweetest face in the world." We saw her miniature just now. And another, Sheridan Knowles, wrote to her son Joseph, "Dad the Dean and his angel wife." Emma and Thomas moved to Abington in 1826, as we've heard. He had become Dean of Emily. And their sons, William and Joseph Sheridan, the novelist, both had many memories of their boyhood there. But a great sadness came over the family with the death in 1841 of the only daughter, Catherine. And in his eulogy praising her wondrous goodness, her brother didn't omit her cleverness, for Catherine too had published as a contributor to the Dublin University magazine, including in 1840 The Botheration of Billy Cormac. But to return to Frances Chamberlain, her grandson, Thomas Sheridan, son of the playwright, married a Scottish lady, Henrietta Callender, who was quite a well-known novelist. And Carwell, in particular, was one that was published not just in England, but also translated into French and published in France. And Thomas and Catherine's daughters, Helen, Caroline, and Georgiana, were known as the Three Beauties, and Helen and Georgiana both married into the English aristocracy. Two of the sisters, Helen and Caroline, published extensively, inheriting not only the gifts of their grandfather, Richard Brinsley Sheridan, but no less his wife, their musical grandmother, Elizabeth Linley. Helen, who married Lord Dufferin, composed poems and songs, the music as well as the words, and after her death, her son, who's famous for other reasons, published all her work. It was published by John Murray, so a very well-established publisher. And then her younger sister, Caroline, made a disastrous marriage to the abusive George Norton. She published a lot. She published novels, songs, poems, and also political writings. And her publishers were John Murray and also Macmillan, so very well-established English publishers. And of 5 or 6 novels, several achieved fame, namely Stuart of Dunleith and Lost and Saved. They were published 1850s, 1860s. And they draw very heavily on her own experience of unhappy marriage and losing the custody of her children. Today, Mrs. Norton is chiefly celebrated for her success in changing the laws governing married women, because in the early 19th century, married women had no rights concerning their property nor their children. All aspects of their lives belonged to their husbands. But Caroline's pamphlet of 1837, Separation of Mother and Child, was instrumental in the eventual changing of the law, partially changed in 1839 and more completely changed in 1873. And then her later articles, English Laws for Women in the 19th Century and A Letter to the Queen on the Marriage and Divorce Bill, they were published by Longman, and they were equally influential. And so finally the Acts in London of 1857 and 1870 finally established some rights for married women. And of course at that date those were acts which affected Ireland as much as England. So now to move on a little in time, in the next generation was Eleanor Frances LeFanu, the daughter of the novelist Joseph Sheridan LeFanu, who spent his boyhood here. She wrote under the name Russell Gray. She published poetry and 3 novels, Never Forever, that's published in 1867, John Haller's Niece, and Up and Down the World, a couple of years later. And then in turn, her daughter, Frances Robertson, who was known as Fairy Robertson, had short stories published and a play produced in Dublin around 1900. So it continues. In the 20th century, Claire Sheridan, born in 1885, was well known both as a sculptor, which is interesting, but also as a journalist. And she was much travelled, so she published extensively because she could draw not only on her journalist experience, but as a result of her travels. A lot of her books were effectively travel books. Her husband was a descendant of Richard Brinsley's son, Thomas. And younger than her, but a direct descendant of the playwright, was Lady Caroline Blackwood, who was born in 31 and died in 1996, so quite recent. She published 9 novels, several collections of short stories. Her work won a number of prizes and was shortlisted for the Booker Prize. She was born into an ascendancy family, Dufferin and Guinness. You could hardly get more ascendancy than that. And she lived in high society as a result, dividing her life between England, Ireland, and America. Her first husband was the artist Lucian Freud, and several of his most famous paintings are of her. And her third husband was the poet Robert Lowell. Now finally I'm approaching the 3 living LeFanu writers who are published in the 21st century, and all of whom are well known to me. So it does seem as though the literary gene, if I can call it that, is still in evidence. Jane Christie is, like me, a great-granddaughter of William Richard LeFanu, who spent his boyhood here at Abington. Jane was born in 1936, and although she wrote in secret most of her life, it was only 3 years ago that she published her novel, A Just Impediment. It's a love story written in very beautiful, limpid prose, and it's set in the 1960s when homosexuality was still illegal, so the narrator of the story has to keep his passion secret. Jane married Henry Darwin, a grandson of Charles Darwin, and of her 3 daughters, one has become an acclaimed writer, Emma Darwin. Emma, just like the LeFanu boys' names always being the same, they're always William or Thomas or Joseph, so we find Emma as a name in our family cropping up many times, like the Emma Lucretia who lived here. Emma Darwin came to attention firstly when she won a short story prize for the BBC, and then she went on to achieve great success with 2 major novels, as well as other shorter fictions. Her debut novel was called The Mathematics of Love, and it combines 2 eras, that of the Napoleonic Wars and our own time, and it received glowing reviews. The Independent said, "The reader is spellbound, it's electrifying." And she also wrote one called A Secret Alchemy, which is very moving. It's set in the Middle Ages and creates a new and convincing perspective on the murder of the 2 child princes in the Tower. And the last author to bring to your attention is Sarah LeFanu, yet another person with both the Sheridan and the LeFanu heritage. Sarah's published widely, particularly biographies, as well as studies of what it is to be a biographer. I found her Life of the writer Rose Macaulay a very brilliant read. Again, still in print, you can easily get hold of it. And Sarah wrote a very amusing radio play about Rose Macaulay for the BBC. It's called Thin Woman in a Morris Minor, because Rose Macaulay was notorious for being an extremely bad driver. Sarah's worked as a broadcaster, as an editor, notably for the Woman's Press, and like her cousin Emma Darwin, she teaches creative writing. And you can read short stories by Sarah LeFanu and Emma Darwin in the collection Dreams of Shadow and Smoke, which was published in Dublin in 2014 in celebration of the bicentenary of the birth of Sir Joseph Sheridan LeFanu. So those 2 living cousins of mine are in the same volume. Now I just want to step back a moment, because I began with Frances Chamberlain, and I want to read you a few lines of one of her comedies. The play is A Journey to Bath, and the character is a widow, Mrs. Tryford. She's very anxious to marry her daughter Lucy to the elderly Lord Stukely, but she keeps getting her words muddled up. Anyway, Lucy has a much nicer young man in mind, not a lord. This is Mrs. Tryford. I declare this is a fatiguing life one leads, and exhilarates one's spirit so much I have scarce strength to rise. Now Lord Stukely is one of the best bred men living, and takes such pains to teach my Lucy and make her illiterate. In everything he is a progeny. He is a terrestrial man altogether, and so free and comprehensive. Well, we have a name for these words. They are malapropisms, from the famous character in The Rivals. So Sheridan lifted the character, Mrs. Malaprop, the idea of her, from his mother's play. I think it's fascinating to explore the lives of all these remarkable women. Almost all of them raised children, as well as pursuing their writing. On the one hand, the LeFanu families lived in Ireland until the mid-20th century. Like my grandfather died in 1945. And they were active middle-class citizens. They were never landed gentry. They were civil servants, clerics, lawyers, writers. But the Sheridans divided their lives between Ireland and England, and like the playwright, they moved in high society. But nevertheless, the Irish and English cousins always kept in touch with each other. That blood relation meant they felt they were one family, though they'd become different. Anyway, for me, it's been a real pleasure to research and read the works of all these gifted women, from the 18th century right to today and continuing. So I'm really glad to have had the chance to introduce them to you.